Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Italian Grand Prix. So welcome to the race ratings series, this time for Italy in Monza, just having a look at how the drivers did, their performances, where they started, where they finished, looking at their pace during the races and determining how well they've done over the course of the Sunday. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend. And before we get into the video, just a quick reminder to give it a thumbs up if you enjoy it and subscribe down below for more F1 content every week. Now with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. So starting with the result, and it is another Max Verstappen win, the 5th in a row, this time on Ferrari's home turf. Leclerc there in second, not quite getting a final chance to have a go for the win with the late safety car, we'll talk about that in a little bit. In third place, Mr. Consistent George Russell doing really well with his Mercedes. Sainz in fourth, a great drive through the field from him, started back down in like 18th, 19th, right at the back of the field. And then behind him is Lewis Hamilton, who started one place behind Sainz and finishes one place behind him in 5th too. Then it's Perez in 6th with Lando in 7th. Poor Lando was running sick, pitted for the safety car at the end, came out in 7th, and the race didn't get going. As I said, we'll get into that. In 8th, Pierre Gasly spent basically his entire race behind a McLaren and finishes behind one too. Then in 9th place, Nick de Vries, 2 points on debut for Williams, replacing Alex Albon, a tremendous drive from him. Honestly, what does this guy have to do to get an F1 seat? Then in 10th, the final point goes to Zhou Guanyu and his Alfa Romeo. Getting to the race itself, and it was actually a pretty hectic start. You know, we had Leclerc and Russell, P1, P2, going side by side into the first turn. Russell having to cut across to avoid contact. Then behind you had Max Verstappen up from 8th to 4th, I think it was, on the first lap, then into 3rd, overtaking Ricciardo. His teammate, however, Perez, losing some places, down a couple few from 13th, maybe to 16th, I think it was. Then once we sort of settled into the race, it became pretty clear that a lot of people were getting stuck in the Daniel Ricciardo train. I want to say it was always at least maybe 5, 6 cars. But then once everything was kind of settled, Sebastian Vettel, his car stops on track, he retires, which gave Ferrari the chance to come in and get a sort of semi-free pit stop with the VSE on half the time they're kind of in the pit lane, converting Leclerc what may well have been a 1-stop to a 2-stop, and honestly that's probably where the race was lost for them. From there though, watching Sainz and Hamilton making their way through the fields, it was kind of like they came up to DRS trains and because they were in faster cars managed to get through. However, in those DRS trains we got to see Nick de Vries defend for his first points. That was really great to watch, defending from Zhou for I don't know how many laps. And then we get to the end where Danny Ric retires, safety car comes out, and there's not enough time to get it going. I think you could look into that and say there's a few things they probably got wrong, you know, picking up Russell, for example. It took them a while to realise that car wasn't going to move, but still, it's kind of like the anti-Abu Dhabi, where instead of rushing and getting it going and it being kind of controversial, they stuck to the procedures and there wasn't enough time, and sometimes that's just racing. On to the ratings then, and for the race from the YouTube poll, we're going to start with that as usual. You guys are giving it a 5.4, which is a little step down from the past couple of races, and to be honest, that sounds about right. For me, I've gone slightly lower, and I'm actually going to give it a 5. And there's a combination of things for that. You know, yes, there was some battling going on, and we had cars making their way through, but it wasn't like it was crazy action or anything, so maybe you think, okay, it's a 6, 6.5. Combine that with, honestly, what I remember the most being the Daniel Ricciardo DRS train, along with the ending that never was. Yes, they follow the rules and that's fine, no problems there, but it would have been nice if we did see some action at the end. That would have been really exciting, but that does bring it down just a little bit. Getting into the teams and starting with Aston Martin, and it's a double DNF, no points for them. After the past few races, they look to be making progress. For drivers, I'll start with Vettel. It's a pretty quick one. He retired on lap 11, I think it was, just power issues, I think, with the car. Ultimately, not his fault, not too much he could do. He started in 11th and was sort of running in 12th by the time, so it's going to be a not applicable rating for him. Car dies a few laps in, not too much more to say on that one. Then on to his teammate Stroll, who actually when the time Vettel retired, Stroll was running just ahead of him. However, afterwards we sort of saw he would consistently be dropping back from Zhou, who was at the back of that Ricciardo train, to the point where I think it was on lap 14, he was already 4 seconds back. And ultimately, while I think the Aston Martin didn't have the best of pace for the weekend, it really didn't look like Stroll was getting that much out of it. And then later on, had to retire the car, that's not his fault at all. So for a rating for Stroll, I think I'm going to have to go with a 4. It's generally sort of below average just because the pace clearly was dropping off the cars in front. Without his teammate, it's kind of hard to judge how good the pace of the car was. It didn't look too amazing, but still, it overall just felt like a pretty disappointing race for him. Next up we have Haas, and no points picked up for them, and it's getting really tricky to see whether or not their pace is going to be quick or slow or maybe somewhere in between, just very inconsistent at the moment. For drivers, I'll start with Mick Schumacher, who started way down in 17th place, actually lost a place on the opening lap, so it wasn't the best of starts, but from there just slowly made his way up the pack. He got past Magnussen, and then with his pace compared to Tsunoda, who was ahead of him for a lot of the race, he held his own and was roughly the same gap behind. Ran long in, swapped the soft tyres later on, and then had a really nice battle with Nicholas Latifi, eventually coming out ahead. Again, it's Latifi, I don't know how much of a compliment that really is, but eventually made his way up into 12th, getting past Tsunoda for what is actually a pretty decent result coming from 17th. I think for rating, I'm actually going to give him a 7. It was between a 6.5, 7, but to me I look at it and he goes 17th to 12th. Good racing, generally good pace, it's a pretty above average good performance. So yeah, 7 for Mick. Then we have Magnussen, who, like his teammates, started fairly far down. He was in 16th, but gained a fair few places on the opening lap. I think it was +4 by lap 1 or lap 2. However, it turned out that was because he cut across the first chicane and gained some places, didn't give them back, which meant he got a 5-second penalty for leaving the track and then gaining an advantage. That was eventually served at his pit stop, but before then he was on the medium tyres like Mick Schumacher, his teammate, and was caught by Mick, overtaken by Mick, and then while Mick Schumacher went forwards, Magnussen just kind of stayed where he was. Stopped onto the hards, which took him to the back with that penalty, and then just really seemed to struggle to get those tyres working and eventually finished last of the finishers. So rating wise for Magnussen, I think it's going to be a 3.5. Yes, the strategy wasn't great going mediums hard, but he was still clearly slower than his teammate, and even on the hard tyres, some people kind of made it work, whereas for him, he was just absolutely nowhere. Next up we have Alpine, and honestly I was expecting a lot more of them coming into the weekend, considering they seem to have a fairly quick car in a straight line. For drivers, I'll start with Alonso, who actually started up in P6, lost a place on the opening lap and found himself then stuck in the Danny Ric DRS train for pretty much the entire time he was out on track. Was actually overtaken by Norris within that train and then got back through when Lando made a mistake. He elected to stay out longer than the likes of Ricciardo and Gasly, who came in around him, and that meant he was on track with Hamilton for a little bit, held him up fairly well, that was decently good enough driving, however then had to retire through no fault of his own, the team called him in. So for Alonso for a rating, I think it's probably just a 5.5, if I have to say it's fairly average, that's just kind of how it feels. Yes, he was stuck in the DRS train, but he did get overtaken, which not many people did when they were stuck behind Ricciardo, so on the whole I think it's got to go down as a pretty average, very middling result. Then next we have Esteban Ocon, who started down in 14th, didn't really make much progress early on, and then sort of found himself stuck behind both Aston Martin cars, especially Lance Stroll. Started on the softs and then elected to change onto the hard tyres, and from there just slowly was making progress, really slowly catching Joe to the point where he started 5 seconds behind, and around sort of 25 laps later when the Ricciardo safety car came out, he was about 1.5 seconds behind. So actually when I look at that, the pace really wasn't too great, he was only just faster than Alfa Romeo. So rating wise for Ocon, I think it's probably going to have to be like a 4. Definitely didn't seem to have the best of races, and the pace itself didn't look too great even if he was stuck behind some cars at points. Next up we have Alfa Romeo, and I'm glad to say that compared to usual they both managed to finish the race and actually pick themselves up a point. For drivers, I'll start with Joe, who started on the medium tyres and very quickly found himself part of the Danny Ric train. Actually the last car in that stuck behind De Vries, looking at the back of that Williams for pretty much the entire race, even towards the end when De Vries was trying to hold on, it was Joe behind him. However, what can be said from that is that although yes, he's not able to make any progress, he was still keeping on the back of the likes of Norris and Alonso and Ricciardo in the McLarens and Alpines who were at the front of that train. Also, his teammate was incredibly far back in this one, so he's beaten him quite comprehensively. Rating wise for Joe, I think it's going to be a 7. Yes, not too much has happened, but he's held onto the back of what is effectively a McLaren and Alpine train, and has then picked up a point at the end. Then we get to Valtteri Bottas, who started down in 15th place and very quickly found himself pretty much all the way at the back, if not last, within a lap or two. I think he actually made contact with Kevin Magnussen into the opening corner, just going a bit too deep, a bit too late, and hitting the back of the Haas car. From there though, found for a lot of the time he was behind Mick Schumacher, he closed up behind him and stuck behind him for a little bit, Eventually those two both putting onto soft, so Bottas was on soft tyres at the end and was making progress, got past Latifi, we saw that into turn 1, and then got past Tsunoda as well, so he was making progress on the soft tyres later on. So actually looking at it, I don't think Bottas's pace was actually horrendous. However, because of that really bad start, found himself at the back trying to get past cars, and when you're in an Alfa Romeo, it's kind of tricky. Rating wise for Bottas, I think it's going to come out as a 5. Ultimately, it's a very subpar start, but overall good race pace, which to me gives him a final rating just below average. Next up we have Williams, who come away with the joint best finish for them this season of a P9, and it's kind of a case of, in the hands of a competent driver, that car can do okay. And with drivers, I'll start with Nick de Vries. I've not prepared like a graphic or anything for him just because it should be a one-off performance. However, I will talk a little bit about how he's done, which is obviously incredibly well. He started up in 8th place and has only really lost out to say like Hamilton or Perez or Sainz coming behind, and has eventually picked up not 1 but 2 points in his F1 debut. And ultimately he had half a session on Saturday to get used to that car in FP3, and has comprehensively beaten Latifi, which honestly looks really bad for the Canadian, but for Nick himself it's a great performance. If I was keeping track of a rating for him, it's probably going to be like a 9, just because there were like a few little lockups and things in there, a couple of little mistakes, but on the whole it was a really great performance. Then we get on to Latifi, who started in 10th but really didn't have a great start, and within like 2 laps or so was already down to 16th. And in that Williams car, as we've seen, it can defend from cars, but trying to make your way through the field, not really going to happen. However, it must be said, compared to his usually appalling race pace, it wasn't too terrible. He found himself most of the time sort of around Lance Stroll, Yuki Tsunoda, and was definitely with other cars as opposed to just being quite far at the back. That being said, he has been very comprehensively beaten by someone who it's their very first race in Formula 1. Considering he's been in there for 2.5 years, that doesn't really bode too well. So rating wise for Latifi, I think it's probably going to be a 3.5. Where the race pace maybe gives him like a 4, 4.5 below average. Considering where De Vries was, you've got to knock off a little bit for that too. Next up we have AlphaTauri, and after a few races away from the points, they've managed to pick up a few in this one. For drivers, I'll start with Gasly, who began the race in P5 just behind Daniel Ricciardo, and that's where he stayed the entire time pretty much. I think every time we saw Ricciardo, it was Pierre Gasly just behind. He did have one chance really to get past, where he went deep into turn 1 and sort of lost that opportunity because he had to let Ricciardo back through. Later on did try to pit onto the hard tyres, I believe it was, to try and get the undercut. However, it just didn't work, still came out behind Ricciardo and never really put a challenge on from there. Did have to defend from Nick de Vries at one point, which he did successfully, and eventually finished in P8. So rating wise for Gasly, I think I'm going to have to just give him a 6. On the whole, yes, he's not managed to get past Ricciardo, but then it is an AlphaTauri, it's not the quickest of cars, and at the end of the day has come home with 4 points in 8th place, which isn't too bad. Then we get on to Yuki Tsunoda, who started right at the back in last place, P20, made up a few places early on, gaining 3 places on the first lap or so. From there, just generally ran his race. He found himself behind Esteban Ocon for a bit, and strategy-wise went from medium to hard, which ultimately cost him later on because on the soft tyres, both Bottas and Schumacher made their way past him, and so Tsunoda finished down in 14th, I think it was. Rating-wise for Tsunoda, I think it's going to be a 5.5, smack bang in the middle with average, simply because ultimately, yes, he's gone from 20th to 14th, but 4 of those have been retirements, and didn't look overly incredible pace-wise. Getting overtaken on the soft tyres is more strategy, so on the whole, I think it's just a fairly average performance for him. Then we have McLaren, who, while they've gained points on Alpine ahead of them in the Constructors, will probably be a little bit disappointed to only have 1 car finish, and a little mistake at the end, which we'll get into. For drivers, I'll start with Ricciardo, who became F1's resident train director for this one, holding up I think at least 5 cars all the time. And while yes, that does say that his pace really wasn't great, he did hold them up, and had he not retired later on, was on for a points finish. And in all honesty, other than Gasly at one point, nobody really looked that close to overtaking him. There's really not too much more to say for Ricciardo, and so for a rating, I think I'm actually going to give him probably a 7, because he's managed to hold everyone up, would have been on for some points. However, compared to say Albon at Spa, the pace did look horrendously slow. Like, it was really, really obvious that he was holding up a lot of people. Even the likes of De Vries in a Williams and Zhou in an Alfa Romeo were able to keep to the back of that train. Then we get on to Lando Norris, who started in P3 but very quickly found himself not in third place, given I think he went into anti-stall at the start. Regardless of what happened, dropped a load of places off of the line. It was a really poor start for him, and that of course slotted him in behind his teammate Ricciardo and Fernando Alonso in the Danny Ric train. And that's where he spent a lot of his time. He did get past Alonso at one point, but then made a mistake into turn 1, which allowed Fernando back through. Had he not got himself stuck in that train early on, I honestly think he's looking at 4th to 6th place as a result. And honestly, 6th place was still on, however the team boxed him late under that safety car for soft tyres, thinking it would get going again, but ultimately that just meant that Perez got ahead of him, and from there the race didn't really resume, so Norris was stuck in 7th. Rating wise though, I think I'm going to have to give him a 5, ultimately that start has really cost him. The pace was good when he did get clean air, as we'd kind of expect between him and Ricciardo. However, that start is ultimately what's lost him, and he did make the mistake into turn 1, letting Alonso through. Then next up Mercedes, and while for sure they were nowhere near as quick as they were in the Netherlands, to come away with the points that they have, considering one car started down in 19th, is still pretty good for them. For drivers, I'll start with George Russell, who on the whole had a very quiet race. Did have a very slight chance for P1 into the first corner on the first lap, but eventually had to settle for P2. And then once he was overtaken by Verstappen, I'm pretty sure that's all the action he had for the rest of the race. I was quite impressed by his pace early on, managing to keep with those two on the soft tyres, but then towards the end of that stint really fell away, and going onto the hard tyres afterwards, the pace deficit was really clear to see. So for a rating for George, I think it'll be a 7.5, it's just what I call a very, very solid, very good drive, but definitely not special or anything like that. Ultimately, before the safety car came out, he was almost 30 seconds off of Verstappen in the lead, but still a good performance and a podium. Then we get on to Hamilton, who had a much more eventful race than his teammate George. Started down in P19, and that's where he stayed on the opening lap, cutting turn 1 to avoid contact and collisions and things. Did look to be a bit stuck at first, wasn't really making any progress, but as the laps continued to go on, started to slowly make his way up. Ultimately as well, the Mercedes isn't the quickest in a straight line, and I think we saw that when he came out to the back of Fernando Alonso. Wasn't quite able to get past easily. Took the medium tyres long, and then came out on the soft tyres later on. Very quickly picked his way through that DRS train of Ricciardo, making that double overtake on Norris and Gasly, I think it was, out of turn 2. That was quite nice. And then with the strategy that Red Bull had Perez on, it meant he inherited P5, and that's where he finished. So for a rating for Lewis, I think it's probably going to be an 8, coming from towards the back up to P5 is a great result. However, I will say there were a couple of times where he did look just a little stuck or couldn't quite get past people early on, hence why it's not like a 9 or anything like that, despite coming from 19th all the way up to 5th. Then next up Ferrari, and after starting on pole position, they're for sure going to be disappointed to not have the win in this one, and maybe a little bit unlucky to not quite get the chance at the end. For drivers, I'm going to start with Leclerc. Obviously started on pole position and held off George Russell into the first turn. From there, built a couple of seconds to Verstappen behind, however it did look like Max was just slowly closing that gap in. Then when Vettel retired, they came in and sort of had like a semi-free pit stop, because the VSC was on for sort of half the time they were in the pit lane. Just about managed to come out ahead of Ricciardo, which I think was really important. However, that did kind of commit them to a 2-stop strategy, which as we saw later on, really didn't pan out. The pace that he had on the soft tyres compared to Verstappen's mediums at the end was really poor, honestly. You know, after that second stop came out about 20 seconds behind Verstappen, and then 14-15 laps later, when the safety car was eventually called, had only gained about 3.5 seconds or so. With the safety car at the end, yes, it would have been nice to see them fight for the win on the last lap or so. However, ultimately, if there isn't the time for them to clear everything, which there wasn't, then that's just how it is. The race is going to end like that, and sometimes that is just racing. For a rating for Leclerc, I actually think it's going to be like a 6.5, mostly because while I think Verstappen probably wins that race regardless of what happens with strategy, the pace at the end on those soft tyres where the degradation wasn't too high, to only be closing at like a 10th or 2 per lap just really isn't that great, and hence that's just given him that lower rating. Then we get on to Carlos Sainz, who, like Hamilton, started towards the back with engine penalties. However, he made really good progress early on, and by lap 6 was already up like P11 or so. And honestly, that meant that it was so much easier for him to then cut through cars because he'd already got past the load and wasn't too far off of people. We saw him as well when he came up to the back of cars in the Ricciardo train, just slowly picking them off one by one. And that was when he was on the mediums as well. It wasn't like he was on soft tyres compared to mediums ahead or anything like that. Later on in the race, he came up to Sergio Perez and made a really nice move into turn 4, I think it was, that second chicane, to get past the Red Bull really quickly. So on the whole, I'd have to say that Carlos Sainz has had a really great race. Yes, you would expect the Ferrari to come through the field, but the manner in which he's done it has been really great. So for a rating for Sainz, I honestly think it's going to be a 9. Had he started up near the front, I genuinely think he would have been at least on pace with Leclerc and gone very well, but it's those overtaking moves and making quick work of cars ahead of him that have boosted his rating. Next up, Red Bull, who despite having their cars starting I think 7th and 13th it was, have still come away with the win. It's now their 5th win in a row. For drivers, I'll start with Perez, who had a pretty bad opening lap actually, dropping from say 13th down to 16th. Also had to make a very early pit stop onto hard tyres, and afterwards I've heard Red Bull have said it was because they had a flat spot and the vibrations were getting too big. While I've not seen the clip itself, ultimately if it's a flat spot on the tyres, that means it's a lock-up, and that's probably Perez's fault. So that brought him in early, and that put him onto the hard tyres to then go long. He did also have the brake issues. We saw a lot of smoke coming from the front right tyre, the front right brake duct, eventually clearing itself, but at one point it did look like it could possibly be a terminal issue. Made steady progress on the hard tyres, and actually by boxing early, it meant he could sort of pull like a massive undercut on a lot of people ahead of him, which meant that his race was then a little bit easier later on. Did have Sainz come up to him, and with hard tyres, it's not too much he can do to defend. Did find himself then slotted into 5th place, and because the hard tyres had been on for a while and Hamilton was catching with softs behind, Red Bull decided to box in for another set of softs to end the race. That put him behind Norris, but eventually when the safety car came out, McLaren pitted Norris hoping to get more running, and that put the McLaren behind Perez and he finished 6th. While I think generally he's driven okay, the biggest thing that compromised his race was that early pit stop and putting him onto the hards, which then meant he had to take another stop later on. And from the sounds of things, if it's vibrations from a flat spot, that's probably on him, so he's kind of compromised his own race there. For a rating for Checo, I honestly think it's probably going to have to be like a 5, because if he has compromised his own race, that's his fault, and while he's made steady progress on the hard tyres, I think the race pace wasn't terrible. If you compare to Verstappen, who is miles out in the lead, he probably should be doing better as a result on the whole. And then finally Max Verstappen, obviously taking the win, this time from 7th on the grid. He's making a bit of a habit from winning races from further back. Made great progress on the opening lap. I think I mentioned it slightly early on. He went from 7th or 8th or wherever he was up to 3rd place by basically the end of lap 1. Overtook George Russell, no problems, and then once Ferrari pitted, just had a pretty lonely race out in the lead. For a strategy, went soft mediums, which honestly seemed like probably the best way to go, that or the medium softs, and his pace on those medium tyres at the end was really great. I've talked about how Leclerc's pace on the softs was pretty disappointing, but that in turn means that Verstappen was going really well on those medium tyres. For a rating for Verstappen, I honestly think it's going to be a 9. When you look at his start, he's made up places super early, super quickly, got past Ricciardo as well at the end of lap 1, he's already up into the podium places by turn 1 on the 2nd lap. From there, makes quick work of Russell and was catching Leclerc, who was in the lead at the time, both of them on the soft tyres. Also, when I consider that Leclerc was kind of docked points for not having a great pace at the end, on vice versa, Verstappen's pace was really amazing, which then boosts his rating as well. So there you have the race ratings for the 2022 Italian Grand Prix. Carlos Sainz, with probably what I've got to say may well be his best race of the year, cutting his way through the field. On the whole though, I'd say these ratings feel generally a little bit lower than usual. I guess it's a combination of I'm trying to give slightly lower ratings when people haven't done well, but also there were a lot of cars who I think just didn't do too great. And then with the overall standings, no real movers up the top, Verstappen still clearly in the lead. In behind though, Carlos Sainz has gained a couple of places, up from where he was before in P10 to about 8th place. Meanwhile at the back, Mick Schumacher has jumped Yuki Tsunoda, and Latifi is still solidly in last place. But anyway, that is all for now. As mentioned before, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more F1 content. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and comments and different opinions down in the comments below. But until next time, take care.